General Government Committee will now come to order. Staff, please call the roll. Here.
Here.
Here. If we do have a quorum, which we do, we will proceed as a full committee. Members, please review the minutes of our last hearing. Are there any corrections? Seeing none, the minutes stand approved. We will now bring before us S.J.R. 2 for its first hearing. Senator McCauley and Senator Gavarone, you may proceed when ready.
Thank you, Chairman Ruley, Vice Chair Scheuring, Ranking Member DeMora. Thank you for allowing us to provide sponsor testimony in favor of Senate Joint Resolution 2, which would place on the ballot for Ohioans' consideration a proposed amendment to Article 2 of the Ohio Constitution to require a vote of at least 60% of the electors to approve a constitutional amendment. Over the years, Ohio's Constitution has been easily influenced by outside groups and special interests seeking to alter our Constitution for their own benefit. We've witnessed time and time again as special interests buy their way into a statewide ballot, only to spend millions of dollars drowning the airwaves seeking to secure permanent, fundamental changes to our state by a vote margin of 50% plus one vote. Our founding fathers established a United States Constitution that protects against such outside influence and moneyed interests by requiring a supermajority vote for amendments, a 2/3 vote by both chambers of Congress, and a vote of 3/4 of the state legislatures. It's time we extend similar protections to the Ohio Constitution. Protecting the Ohio Constitution is not a new idea, rather something that's been eagerly anticipated. S.J.R. 2 is the type of reform that's been discussed by the former Ohio Constitutional Modernization Commission, by current and former legislative leaders, in the pages of Ohio's newspapers, and at many public forums in between. S.J.R. 2 is the type of reform that's already received an endorsement of raising the threshold for adoption of constitutional amendments. This can be found in the final report by the Ohio Constitutional Modernization Committee's Constitutional Revision and Updating Committee. We are referencing a bipartisan committee governed by Democratic Senator Vernon Sykes and Democrat State Representative Glenn Holmes, who specifically recommended to the full commission that the threshold for adopting amendments to Ohio's Constitution be raised to at least 55%. Let us not fail to recognize Ohio as among the minority of states that even permit constitutional amendments by initiative petition at all. 33 states do not allow constitutional amendments to be proposed by outside groups. By the same token, of the 17 states which do allow constitutional amendments by initiative petition, 9 of those states, red and blue, have added some form of enhanced requirement for them to be adopted. Florida is functioning similarly, as the state requires a 60% vote for adoption, just as S.J.R. 2 is proposing. Colorado requires a 55% vote to approve constitutional amendments, while Live Free or Die, New Hampshire requires a 66% vote to amend its constitution. Illinois requires either a 60% vote margin on the amendment itself or 50% plus one on all of the total ballots cast in the applicable election. Arizona requires a 60% vote threshold for amendments that involve tax increases. There's several important notes to make about this constitutional amendment. S.J.R. 2 preserves the initiative petition form of amendment and does not take away the ability of Ohioans to offer amendments to Ohio's Constitution. And S.J.R. 2 preserves the ability of any group to propose amendments to the Constitution, but it also ensures that all communities are represented for purposes of determining what ideas will make it to the ballot. Lastly, similar to H.J.R. 1, if adopted, S.J.R. 2 will apply all the proposed constitutional amendments offered by the legislature as well. Allowing special interests to corrupt the state of Ohio by funding amendments for their own benefit first and the public benefit last is not the best interest of either party. Chairman Ruley, Vice Chair Scheuring, Ranking Member DeMora, thank you again for the opportunity to present Senate Joint Resolution 2. Thank you for recognizing the importance of this legislation, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Thank you so much, Senator Gavarone, for your testimony. I would like the audience to recognize Senator Nikki Antonio. Additionally, pursuant to the rules, we are welcoming the leader of the minority party to join us in committee today for non-voting. Welcome. I will start off the questions to Senator Gavarone. I know when we do constitutional amendments in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives, the threshold is 75%. So why did you choose 60% instead of 75%?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, if you look at the amendments that have been proposed over the years, a lot of significant proposals have come out of both the General Assembly and petition initiative. And the vast majority of those have passed by 60% or more. So we want to make sure that this is something that is attainable and that still allows access, but makes a higher threshold. It's important, if you're talking about changing our founding document, that there be a higher degree of scrutiny, a higher level of approval for that.
Follow-up. So to prevent mob rule of just like 50% plus one, you feel that 60%, perhaps because of these other states that chose the 60% instead of the 75%? Because I'm a little bit gray on like why we wouldn't have gone for 75% and just kept it at 60. You're out of order. We will stand in recess. The committee will now come back to order. As a point of reference, there is no recording of the committee by a cell phone unless you're registered, so please keep that in mind, and I will let you finish the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 60% was kind of a sweet spot when you look at increasing the threshold vote requirement and compare that to what other states are doing. I'd also like to point out that citizen-initiated legislative changes, that threshold has not changed. That would still be 50% plus one vote. So, and that's more of an appropriate lane for making some of these policy changes that really don't have a place in our state's founding document.
Thank you so much. Questions for the witness? Senator Moore?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Gavarone, I have a few questions. The first is, I have an amendment that would, if you accept it, would make this amendment, if the voters pass it, need 60% to pass. Is that something you guys are willing to do?
Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Senator McCauley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's actually a question that's been asked before. Given the fact that the Constitution currently requires a 50% vote threshold for constitutional amendments, I don't believe we could even set a higher threshold without a constitutional amendment to do so. And so even though I see why you would do that, even though that might be the case, I don't know that we could do it even if we wanted to.
Well, if we could, would you do it?
In this case? Well,
Yeah.
I'm not dealing in hypotheticals. I think we wouldn't be allowed to do it under the current draft of the Constitution.
Okay, thank you. Senator Gavarone, you mentioned the 55% that the Constitutional Revision Committee stated, but you're leaving out the fact that that was in exchange for a safe harbor period of 5 years so that any citizen initiative right now, though, can be wiped out. So are you willing to put a 5-year, add 5 years, those things that are already going can pass as the Constitutional Revision Committee recommended as part of their report to go along with the 55%?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just point of clarification, Senator DeMora, you're asking if we would raise the safe harbor, for lack of a better term, for statutory initiatives from 3 to 5 years in exchange for what we're doing right here. Is that correct?
Well, that was, I said,
Questions
I'm
to the
sorry.
chair.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I apologize. Senator, what I'm saying is that she quoted the 55% part of it, but didn't quote the other part of it, which was a compromise between the two sides at the time about raising it or not raising it, and that was going to allow a safe harbor period of longer time. Does that mean this bill doesn't at all address that? It just, she quoted one part of it, just pointing out that she quotes one part of something and not the other, and it's not fair to have just one of them, to use one part of it and not the part of the whole part of compromising in the first place. So,
To the chair, to the senator. This is just me personally speaking. I'm not speaking on behalf of Senator Gavarone or on behalf of the caucus or anybody else who might be in favor of this. I would be open to the conversation of doing that. I think you get into the question of, if we were to change both in the same ballot question, is that a violation of the single question requirement? And so I believe they may have to be two separate questions put to the voters if we were to do that. I could be wrong on that, but that's my understanding at least.
Follow up?
yes, sir. I'll ask another hypothetical question. So, do you know how many people voted in last August 2022's primary? How many people, the percentage of eligible voters that voted? It was 8%. So this goes on the ballot in August as the next piece of legislation is coming up that you're proposing. Basically, 4.01% of the electorate can vote on something that could determine what 96% can and can't do. If that's, I mean, is that your intent as well?
To the chair, to the senator, that would absolutely not be our intent. I think there were a variety of reasons why you could attribute the low turnout in that last August election. But I would find it hard-pressed that we'd have the same low turnout of a constitutional question like this.
Follow up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So are the sponsors okay with 14 members of the Senate or 40 members of the House stopping any bill from being passed? Because that's what this is doing. It's allowing 40% of the population to stop what the clear majority wants to pass. So I'm sure you wouldn't be agreed for 14 senators stop every bill that came through here. I mean, it's the same thing, isn't it?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the senator, I respectfully feel that's a pretty false equivalency compared to what we're talking about right now. We're talking about a constitutional amendment. And so the better equivalent, if you were to make that analogy, would be if we were raising the statutory initiative to 60%, which we are not. What we are talking about here is the constitutional amendment process, which also requires us in the legislature to even put it on the ballot to have 60% to be able to do it. And so respectfully, I believe the example you cited is a false equivalency.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, well, I mean, I'll
And then we're going to move this.
Okay, great. I have one last one. So, well, I'll defer to my colleague.
The chair recognizes Senator Antonio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for welcoming me to the committee as well. Pun intended, there's an elephant in the room, and it is the fact that a lot of folks are questioning whether or not there's either coincidence or intentional timing of this piece of legislation being introduced, because not only does it change the threshold for these constitutional amendments, but it also changes the date for which this would be considered. Now, so my question is, was this 60% threshold chosen in response to polling that basically there's been a lot of talk about approximately 59% of Ohioans would add reproductive rights to the state's constitution? So is that the reason why we're seeing this today?
From the chair to the senator, thank you for that question. Actually, this is something that's been discussed since my very first full term in the General Assembly, when I was a member of the House, legislation had been introduced to do just this. So it's something that's been discussed in ongoing conversations over the years, including an issue that was studied by that commission. So certainly there's been heightened awareness to the issue, but it's certainly not a new issue.
Follow-up?
Follow up, Senator?
Thank you, Chair. So with regard to an August special election, again, there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not Ohio should even be participating at all in special August elections. Not all that long ago, we heard from our Ohio Secretary of State, who said that because we have embarrassingly low voter turnouts, that just a handful of voters end up making big decisions. I think my colleague was pointing that out. This isn't how democracy is supposed to work. It doesn't have to work that way. Voters are just as capable of voting on these important issues in primary and general elections. There's no reason why we can't have them happen at the regularly scheduled primary and general election times. That's our Secretary of State saying that. So can you tell me why this piece of legislation also includes an August special election that will cost the Ohio taxpayers more than $20 million?
To the chair, to the leader. Obviously, Ohio has a long-standing history of August special election, and in fact, there's even though we did change the statute regarding, and I don't want to get too much into Senate Bill 92, which we're going to talk about next, Mr. Chairman, but there's even allowed under certain circumstances still August special elections. As far as the date, we would have preferred to have this in May. And I think the Senate was pretty consistent in its public statements, at least through the Senate president, that we would have preferred to see this done in January and put this up in May during the normal primary election. But unfortunately, that wasn't able to get done.
I have a follow-up.
Follow up, Senator?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that answer. A couple of things have been brought up here today, that part of the reason for this bill is because Ohio wants to be protected from special interests. I think kind of a little hyperbolic, but the term mob rule was even used, that we want to, stop that, and certainly we want to stop corruption. Can you tell me what is in this bill that will differentiate between citizens, because I believe right now there is a citizens initiative to amend the Constitution. So what does this bill do to identify and help us identify the difference between citizens and these special outside interest groups?
Senator McCauley?
Okay. So the reference to these special interest groups, you don't have to go back that far in history to realize where they have been spending an awful lot of money in the state of Ohio. I mean, our casinos. If you've gambled in a casino, that is as a result of special interests that have come forward and actually, in that case, inscribed themselves a monopoly in our Constitution by putting parcel numbers in there that are then the only parcel numbers of real estate that can actually have a casino on them in the state of Ohio. And so that wasn't all that long ago. Also looking at a ballot initiative that fortunately was defeated by the state of Ohio, but was really touch and go for a little while, was the last effort at legalizing recreational marijuana. Now, had it just been straight up recreational marijuana, that may very well have passed. But given the fact that it too was following the script of the casino groups that put that in the Constitution, it too tried to put a monopoly into the Ohio Constitution with real estate parcel numbers being put in there by wealthy people who already, coincidentally enough, owned the real estate, that could say the only place that marijuana can be grown in Ohio is on these parcels of real estate. Again, this is not ancient history. This is certainly within the last 20 years that both of these examples have happened. One of them was able to get through, I believe, by a relatively slim margin that now has a monopoly in our Constitution, that if we would have had the elevated threshold, it would have failed. The other one, thankfully, was not able to get through, but still followed the same playbook with wealthy out-of-state interests trying to push an amendment into the Ohio Constitution that would have insulated them from most legislative prerogatives, and would have done so in such a way that it would have made them immensely rich on the backs of Ohioans with nobody able to touch them. And so that's two prime examples that I believe are fresh in everybody's minds.
Follow up.
I'm going to inject for 1 second. Senator McCauley, could you educate me, because I wasn't here when adult use was on the ballot. Could you go through the steps with that as far as when and where on the calendar year that happened? And was it a special election? Was it a regular election? What was the vote? What was the threshold? Just because of my lack of knowledge on that particular subject, because I do think it's applicable to what we're doing.
So I may be off a little bit on the years, but it was certainly when I was in the legislature. So it would have been 2015 or 16, I believe, around those time frames. And it was a lot of out-of-state money. I do believe there are a lot of names that you would have recognized that were as part of that campaign. One that, for one reason or another, still comes to mind is, well, I'm not going to mention names. I probably shouldn't do that in this. But the denial, so it was November 2015, and would have granted a monopoly for the commercial production and the sale of marijuana for recreational and medicinal purposes. 63% of the voters ended up voting against that. That, however, was, in this case, I know in many cases we were being given polling, and I think there was even some polling that was publicly reported that had that issue passing as recently as 3 weeks before the election, and had it passing with a relatively comfortable margin. And I think it wasn't until the public learned about the monopoly provisions that it ended up failing. But it would be a sign that we could have a broad sweeping change into our Constitution that I think most would probably argue should be a statute rather than a constitutional amendment that's supposed to be addressing some of these fundamental rights and other items that could have made its way in at the detriment of a lot of folks in such a way that it would have been bad, because the legislature would not be able to exercise proper regulatory authority over an industry that really needs a good amount of regulatory authority, which I think most people would agree with.
I appreciate the backstory. The chair recognizes Senator Nikki Antonio.
Chair, I just have one last question, and I'll defer to my colleague. As you bring up, in 2015, there was voters passed issue 2, and it did prohibit any petitioner from using the Ohio Constitution to grant a monopoly, an oligopoly, or a cartel for their exclusive financial benefit, or to establish preferential tax status. It also prohibits any petitioner from using the Ohio Constitution to grant a commercial interest, right, or license. So this law is already on the books. Doesn't this law already explicitly protect us from special interest interference?
To the chairman, to the senator, in one way it does. In one way it does, because it does say, look, if you can't put parcel numbers in the Constitution anymore. Well, you can, but I believe the way the Constitution would work is you have to pass it in 2 consecutive elections in order to do that. So in some ways it does provide that protection. In other ways, though, it's not, even if you're not prescribing yourself a monopoly. So let's use a hypothetical example here where if the recreational marijuana folks were to come back and try to put this on the ballot, and they didn't put in place any provisions that said it can only be grown on these parcels, or it can only be grown by companies that are X, Y, and Z, but they could potentially put in there that this is the only regulation that we should be held to in such a way that realistically, in a roundabout way, limits the ability of other companies to enter into the markets. Also, outside of the monopoly, could yield some pretty undesirable results from a public health perspective as it concerns insulating themselves from regulation in such a way that they wouldn't be able to be touched. I think that's a real threat that is still available under the Constitution.
Thank you, Chair.
Chair recognizes Senator DeMora.
Oh, I said the chairwoman, my minority leader just asked the same question I was going to ask Senator McCauley. No problem.
Any further questions? Seeing no further questions, this will constitute the first hearing of S.J.R. 2. The committee would now like to put its focus on bringing forward SB 92 for its first hearing. The chair recognizes Senator McCauley and Senator Gavarone. You may proceed when ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Rulli, Vice Chair Scheuring, Ranking Member DeMora, thank you for allowing us to provide sponsor testimony on Senate Bill 92, which would allow for August special elections for specific purposes. At the current moment, the door is cracked open, so we are able to hold special elections in August for local fiscal emergencies and congressional seats, as well as major statewide issues. What this legislation does is it broadens that language and opens the door slightly more to include General Assembly, specifically include General Assembly initiated constitutional amendments, which require a 3/5 vote in the Senate and a 3/5 vote in the House to even go on the ballot. While questions have been raised in regards to the passage of House Bill 458 last year concerning August special elections, this legislation does not come into conflict with the previous bill from last year. Special elections in August still exist and are permitted to take place under certain circumstances. Senate Bill 92 is just adding to what can be allowed on the ballot in August. We are not reinventing the wheel with this legislation. Chairman Rulli, Vice Chair Scheuring, Ranking Member DeMora, thank you again for allowing us to testify here today on Senate Bill 92, and we are happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Senator, for your testimony. We really appreciate it. Does the committee have questions? Senator DeMora.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, again, Senator, I'm going to point out that if you go back and look at any special election in August, turnout is abysmal. The average turnout for an August election, I believe, is somewhere around 13% at the highest, whereas primaries are higher and general elections are obviously higher than that. So, as I said earlier, we're allowing a small minority of the voters in an August election. And as you said earlier, you assume that people are going to vote more because it's a constitutional amendment. But again, that's an assumption that maybe they will, maybe they won't, and maybe, yes, they'll vote more than they normally do on an August election, so we'll have more than 13%, maybe we'll have all of 28% voting. It's still allowing a small minority of the voters to determine something as important as this. I mean, as Leader Antonio said, again, why can't we just have this in November? If you're going, I'm not an idiot to think that this isn't going to pass through this committee and not going to pass through the Senate, but again, why would we try to do this in August when, as most people don't vote? I mean, studies are there, statistics are there, so we're going to have maybe, if we get an unbelievable turnout of an August special election, we're maybe going to have 25% of the eligible people in Ohio vote to basically gut the ability to change the Constitution. How is that democracy?
Senator Gavarone.
From the chair to the senator, I'd like to respectfully disagree. This bill does not disallow people to vote. This allows all legal voters to vote on this issue. And I am sure that this is going to be, I have every confidence this is going to be widely advertised, that there will be great voter participation in an issue as important as this.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator McCauley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the chairman and to the senator, while I would agree that historically turnout has been lower in August elections, I think casting a broad brush that it's always going to be significantly lower is a little bit too much of a broad statement, because you got to look at the types of issues that come up in August. Typically, you're dealing with sometimes special congressional elections that aren't even statewide issues to begin with. very rarely are you dealing on a statewide issue that would be of the magnitude of this importance. In some cases, you cited, for example, the August election from 2022. In that case, you had a number of uncontested races across the state. So for example, in the 1st Senate district that I represent, I was uncontested. 2 of the other House members in my district were uncontested, and there was only one contested House district even on the ballot, and that was only on the Republican side of the ballot. There were no Democrats in contested elections across the entire district. And so to draw conclusions about August elections broadly regarding without going into the unique circumstances of that election and whether there were questions or races that were applicable across the entire state, I think is, I guess it's not taking into account the entire picture.
Follow up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I mean, Senator McCauley, I don't think we want to talk about the 2022 election as any kind of I mean, for instance, with all gerrymandered districts in the court, didn't know what districts and no one knew who was voting for what or who or where. So I wouldn't use that as an example that no one ran against each other because no one knew. I mean, we had lots of candidates running in other districts that they were thrown out because they got moved out of the districts. So I wouldn't use that as saying that no one runs in these primaries. But you brought that up, so I'm going to say that these are gerrymandered districts we're sitting in right now. But I'm going to go to the cost. I mean, that August last election that no one voted in cost the state $20 million. If you're expecting a lot more people to vote in this election, the cost of the election is going to go way up because of the cost of absentee ballots and everything else and more polling places because, I mean, as rightly people, Board of Elections, at least in Franklin County did last August, they severely reduced the number of polling places because they realized no one was going to vote because of the confusion. But if you're saying now that we're going to have all these people vote, well, then the 20 million price tag is going to be 30 or 40 million. I mean, I know what 30 or 40 million could do to hire nurses or public health officials or those sort of people. But you're talking about wasting $40 million on the special election. I mean, so where does that come into play?
Before we proceed, the audience needs to realize we don't have audience participation. So we've plotted twice, and I appreciate your passion, but please no more. Continue, Senator McCauley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the Senator, I didn't bring up 2022. You did in your first line of questioning. And that's why I responded that it was a unique set of circumstances, which I'm willing to admit to that. The $20 million price tag is not a number pulled out of thin air. That was a number given to us by the Secretary of State as to the amount of money that would be needed to conduct that election. I think if you look at and you try to draw a conclusion based on how much this will cost based on how much 2022 costs, anecdotally, and I'm sure you could ask some of these people, I think we're going to potentially have people testifying tomorrow to this issue. Many of these county boards actually sent money back to the Secretary of State. And so the $20 million was a high number even for the 2022 election. The $20 million that we're given by the Secretary of State is a number that he feels will cover this no matter what. You also have to remember that per the Ohio Revised Code, and again, I think we're going to have the Secretary himself here at some point to testify and probably have some boards of elections folks here to testify as well. Per the Ohio Revised Code, there are certain minimum requirements of staffing and things that you have to do regardless of whether it's going to be a high turnout election, a medium turnout election, or a low turnout election. Those are what I would view as fixed costs almost, and that's, I would say, is probably the majority of the cost associated with administering election because a lot of it has to do with staffing, polling locations, things of that nature.
Follow up?
Well, again, Senator, it's just 20 million or whatever the number is, money that we wouldn't spend if we didn't have to worry about a statewide special election in August. I mean, 20 million is 20 million. I know it might not seem a lot of money in our budget, but $20 million can pay for a lot of other things the state really needs instead of a primary to have a bunch of people vote on a constitutional amendment to take away their rights.
Through the chairman to the representative, certainly the legislature has appropriating authority. This is something that naturally, in order to pass this, we're going to have the appropriate amount of approval to appropriate those dollars. And so I would also say people have elected us to make those decisions. And so I understand you may differ on the use of the money, but I think it is a good use of the money. Now, I would also say this. there's a key phrase you touched on there. People vote to do this. People vote to do this. Somehow, people are looking at this and saying that we, the legislature, are the ones who are putting this directly into the Constitution. The truth of the matter is, people will have a choice in this. All we're doing here is giving them that choice.
Chair recognizes Senator Antonio.
Thank you, Chair. So typically, our overseas voters, many of our military start receiving ballots about 46 days before an election. That's at or around June 23rd this year. If this bill isn't in effect until at the earliest 90 days from early April, that puts the effective date in mid-July. How do you justify discluding taking military voters out of this decision-making?
Senator McCauley.
To the chair, to the leader, this bill would take effect immediately, and here's why. It's because the Ohio Revised Code in section 1.471C states that a provision that has an appropriation where the provision in law, that in this case would be temporary law, is dependent upon that appropriation. And so in this case, certainly the administration of the election is dependent upon that appropriation to be able to conduct it, then that provision of law would take effect immediately. And that's also been upheld by the Supreme Court of the State of Ohio in State Ex Rel Taft versus the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas from 1998. And so this is, as well, when we dealt with Uvalcava voters in the August special election, you'll recall we passed a bill with an emergency clause just to be doubly sure. It went over to the House, and there were members of the House of Representatives who refused to vote for the emergency clause to send the provision overseas, or to allow those ballots to be sent overseas to the voters. That did not have an appropriation in it. We came back on our end and put an appropriation in the bill to pay for those costs, and that took effect immediately through the same section of the Ohio Revised Code that has been upheld by the Supreme Court in the Taft case.
Follow up.
Thank you, Chair. So, thank you for that. I appreciate that answer. So, we've said a few different ways. You know, there's still, it seems like conflicting ideas. We have a legislature that not that long ago did away with August elections in most cases. Now we're stressing an August election to go before the voters to, as my colleague just pointed out, really perhaps take away their ability to make decisions about their personal, private bodies themselves. It feels like a 1-2 punch for many of the voters. So as you're presenting this and defending this legislation, and also the past saying August elections were a bad thing, now they're an okay thing, how do you write this with the Ohio voters who are looking, who are watching us? There's a full room of people who are watching what the legislature does in terms of looking for their ability to have their voice be heard. How do you rationalize this bill, the other bill, in this moment? What do you say to the voters of the state of Ohio that you are not trying to silence them? How do you explain this?
Thank you. From the chair,
Senator Gavron.
From the chair to the senator. Legislation that recently passed did not eliminate all special elections in August. It did allow them for fiscal emergencies, congressional seats, and major statewide issues. This legislation, Senate Bill 92, merely expands that to to constitutional amendments that are initiated by the General Assembly.
Any further questions? No further questions? Well, no further questions, so I will thank you both for your testimony. Since there are no further questions, this will constitute the first hearing of Senate Bill 92. And if there is no further business to be brought before this committee today, seeing none, the committee stands adjourned, and we will see you tomorrow.